She was 7 months pregnant, working a double shift, and still the most competent person on that floor. And Richard Halverson walked in and decided she was the one he could put his hands on. He picked the wrong nurse. He picked the wrong woman, and he had absolutely no idea that the quiet phone contact she kept hesitating to call would be the beginning of everything he was about to lose. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The morning shift at Hargrove Medical Center began the way it always did. Too fast and too loud, with not enough hands and never enough time. The corridors on the 4th floor smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. And the fluorescent lights hummed that particular tune they always hummed when the HVAC system was working too hard. Nurses moved between rooms with that practiced efficiency, born not from ease, but from years of learning how to keep going when your feet hurt and your back aches, and someone down the hall is calling your name before you've even finished answering the last call. Danielle Carter moved through all of it like she'd been born into it. At 28, she was compact and certain in her movements, the kind of nurse that patients trusted before she even spoke, because she carried herself like someone who knew what she was doing and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Her scrubs were a soft navy blue, her natural hair pinned back neatly, and her belly, 7 months now, pressed gently against the fabric. She had modified her movements to accommodate it without thinking about it much, the way you adapt when something becomes part of your daily rhythm. She placed her hand on her stomach sometimes, just briefly, the way a person touches a sore shoulder to remind themselves it's still there. She had been on her feet since 6 that morning. It was now 10:30. Mrs. Bowman in 412 is asking for her pain medication again, said Keisha, one of the younger nurses, falling into step beside Danielle with the practiced urgency of someone who needed to offload information before it slipped. She's not due for another 40 minutes, Danielle said. Tell her I'll come talk to her. Don't just deliver the no through the doorway. Go in and sit with her for a second. Keisha nodded and veered off. Danielle turned toward the nurse's station, reviewing her mental checklist. She had 4 patients whose charts she needed to update, a physician consult to coordinate, and a family meeting at noon she was supposed to help facilitate. She did not consider any of it unmanageable. Hard, yes. Unmanageable, no. That was the difference between experience and exhaustion. Experience taught you how to triage your own energy. She was reaching for a chart when the elevator doors opened. She didn't look up immediately. Elevators opened constantly on this floor, but something about the sound that followed made her pause. Not an alarm, not a crash, just a kind of sudden displacement of the normal noise, like when a large stone drops into still water and everything ripples outward. A man walked in like he owned the building. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with silver-streaked hair that sat precisely on his head, a charcoal suit that hadn't come off any rack, and the confident posture of someone who had not waited in a line in a long time. Behind him, 2 men flanked a third, who was being supported between them, his arm wrapped in a makeshift compression bandage that was already soaking through. Behind all of them was a woman with a tablet and a phone pressed to her ear simultaneously, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of someone whose job it was to clear paths. Richard Halverson didn't look around the way most people did when they entered a hospital. Most people slowed down. The unfamiliarity of it made them careful. The smell, the sounds, the reminder of human fragility everywhere you turned. Our hospitals had a humbling quality that most people, even difficult ones, responded to involuntarily. Halverson walked in and immediately found the nearest person in scrubs, a young male nurse named Derek, and aimed himself at him like a projectile. "I need your trauma bay," he said. Not a request, a statement of logistics, the way you'd announce you needed an elevator. Derek blinked. Sir, you'll need to check in at... I didn't ask you where I need to go. I told you what I need. Halverson turned to the woman with the tablet. Pamela, call Dr. Voss. His cell. Mr. Halverson, Pamela said carefully, with the practiced tone of someone who had been delivering the words, I don't think to this man for years. I don't think they can bypass... Just do it. Danielle set down her chart and walked over. Not because it was strictly her job in that moment, but because Derek was looking slightly panicked, and the man's associate clearly needed medical attention. Sir, she said, stepping forward with the calm, practiced authority she used when she needed someone to hear her before they did something counterproductive, I understand you have someone who needs care. We're going to help him, but I need you to let us follow the admission process so we can do that correctly. Halverson turned and looked at her. He looked at her the way someone looks at a vending machine that's failed to dispense what they paid for, with irritation and a fundamental refusal to see it as having any will of its own. And you are? Danielle Carter. I'm a charge nurse on this floor. Good. Then you can move him to the front. That's not how this works, she said. His condition needs to be assessed first. If it's urgent, triage will reflect that, and he'll be seen immediately. But we can't bypass the process. It exists, so we don't accidentally make things worse. Something shifted in Halverson's expression. It wasn't anger exactly, not yet. It was something colder, the recalibration of a man who had just been told no and was deciding how to respond to that unusual occurrence. Do you know who I am? He said. I do, Danielle said evenly. And that doesn't change what I just said. A few nurses nearby had gone very quiet. A family walking past slowed their steps without meaning to. Halverson held her gaze for a moment and then let out a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Get me someone else, he said. Someone who understands how things work. I understand exactly how things work, Danielle said. I'd like to help you, but I need you to let me do my job. For a moment it seemed like he might let it go. He looked away, exhaled, and took a few steps toward the corridor that led deeper into the floor. Toward the ICU, Danielle realized. Sir, she said, moving to step in front of him. That area is restricted. You can't go in there. He stopped, turned, and then his voice dropped to something quieter, which somehow made it worse. I have a cardiologist friend in this hospital, and I will have your job by the end of the afternoon if you say that word to me one more time. I understand, Danielle said, but the ICU access policy doesn't change based on who you know. Something cracked in his composure. You people, he said, just loudly enough that several heads turned, are why this country's medical system is a disaster, incompetent, bureaucratic, hiding behind your little badges. The words landed in the hallway like something physical. Danielle kept her face still, though her jaw tightened. She'd heard variations of that phrase before, you people, and she knew exactly what it was meant to carry. So did everyone else in that corridor. Sir, I'd ask you to keep your voice. Don't tell me what to do. He moved a step around her. She shifted to block him again, not aggressively, just firmly, the way you position yourself in a doorway. That was when it happened. His right hand came up and struck her across the left side of her face. It wasn't the most violent thing she'd ever seen in this hospital. But in that hallway, in that moment, with every pair of eyes fixed on the scene, the sound of it was extraordinary. A sharp, flat crack that cut through the ambient noise like a blade. Danielle stumbled. Her shoulder caught the wall. Her hand went immediately to her stomach, not to her cheek, to her stomach, and she pressed there for a moment, steadying herself, her breath shallow and fast. The corridor went absolutely silent, not the ordinary quiet of a hospital floor. Something deeper than that, the kind of silence that happens when something has occurred that no one is immediately equipped to process. A nurse somewhere behind Danielle made a sound, not a word, just a sharp intake of breath. A visitor near the waiting area had gone still with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Dr. Ellison, a resident who had been walking toward them, had stopped dead in his tracks 12 feet away. Halverson stood with his hand still slightly raised, his expression passing through something. Surprise at himself, maybe, or just the faint recalibration of someone who had acted without thinking and was now deciding whether to acknowledge it. He chose not to. "I want that nurse removed from this floor," he said to the room in general, his voice already resettling into its usual authority, as if nothing had happened. "She was blocking my access and became aggressive." No one moved. He looked around, seemed satisfied with the silence as a form of compliance, and then walked toward the waiting area and lowered himself into a chair. He took out his phone. He began scrolling. Danielle had not moved from the wall. Her hand was still on her stomach. But there was a heat along the left side of her face that hadn't resolved into pain yet. It would, she knew, but right now it was just heat and the distant ringing of her ears. She breathed slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the same rhythm she taught patients who were in distress. "Danielle." It was Keisha, suddenly at her elbow, voice low and careful. "Are you—" "I'm fine," Danielle said. The words were automatic. She straightened up from the wall and exhaled once more, and then she said more quietly, "Check on Mrs. Bowman. She's been waiting." Keisha stared at her. "Danielle, please." Keisha hesitated, then nodded, her eyes wet, and moved away. Danielle walked to the nurse's station and sat down behind the desk. She pulled a chart in front of her and looked at it without reading it. Around her, on the floor, slowly reanimated, conversations resumed in hushed tones. Footsteps returned. The machinery of the hospital clicked back into its rhythm. But it felt different now. Everything felt like it was running slightly underwater. Later, after the worst of the morning had passed, a nurse named Sandra came and sat beside her in the break room. Sandra was 53, had been at Hargrove for 19 years, and had the particular quality of quiet that comes from having seen too much and surviving it anyway. "You could report it," Sandra said, not pushing, just laying it out there. "There's a process." Danielle looked at her coffee. It had gone cold. "I know there is. HR has to take an assault complaint seriously. There's probably footage." "It's not that simple," Danielle said. Sandra nodded slowly, not pressing. She understood that sometimes those words were fear, and sometimes they were strategy, and sometimes they were something else entirely that didn't have a clean name yet. That night, in the apartment she'd been renting since Marcus left, Danielle sat on the edge of her bed with her phone in her lap. The left side of her face still ached faintly. She'd iced it in the break room, and it hadn't bruised much. Her skin was dark enough to conceal it, but the soreness was there, a dull reminder of the morning. She opened her contacts. Darius. The name sat there on the screen, attached to a number she hadn't dialed in 4 months. She stared at it for a long time, her thumb resting at the edge of the screen. She thought about what it would mean to call him, what it would set in motion. She thought about how far away he was and what he was probably doing, and whether this, her problem, her humiliation, her single bad morning, was something she had any right to drop into his world. She locked her phone and set it on the nightstand. She lay back against the pillows, one hand on her stomach, and closed her eyes. She didn't call. By the following morning, Danielle already knew that the silence around the incident wasn't neutrality. It was strategy. It started with an email from Dr. Patricia Keene, the hospital's chief of medical staff, requesting a brief meeting at Danielle's earliest convenience. That phrasing, earliest convenience, had never once in Danielle's 9 years in nursing meant anything casual. She showed up at 11 before her shift proper began, still in her jacket. Doctor. Keene's office was tastefully arranged in the way that administrative spaces often are. Artwork that communicated competence without opinion, chairs that were comfortable enough to sit in but not comfortable enough to relax. Dr. Keene herself was a composed woman in her late 50s, with reading glasses she wore on a chain, and a careful way of choosing words that Danielle had always respected, right up until the moment she heard what she had to say. "We're all troubled by what happened yesterday," Dr. Keene said, folding her hands on the desk. "And I want you to know that your well-being is genuinely important to this institution." Danielle waited. "That said, we've been made aware that Mr. Halverson's legal team has reached out and—" "I'm sorry," Danielle said, "his legal team." Dr. Keene's expression didn't change. "Yes. They've framed the incident as a mutual altercation and indicated that any formal complaint from your side would be met with a counter-complaint. We're not saying that's right. We're saying it complicates things." "He struck me," Danielle said, "while I was 7 months pregnant, in front of a corridor full of witnesses." "We know, and the hospital does not condone." "Then what are you asking me to do?" Dr. Keene was quiet for a moment. "We're not asking you to do anything. We're asking you to be aware that this situation is sensitive. Mr. Halverson's foundation has been a significant funding partner for our cardiology wing expansion. We're not suggesting that should affect how you choose to proceed, but you should have the full picture." Danielle sat with that for a moment. The full picture. She thought about how long it had taken her to get this job, how long she'd spent building her reputation on this floor. She thought about her baby and her rent and her mother's medication costs and the specific way Dr. Keene was looking at her, not unkindly, but with the practiced distance of someone delivering a message they didn't write. "I understand," Danielle said, and she stood up and left. She did not report it that day. On the other side of the city, in an office that occupied the 47th floor of a glass tower overlooking the river, Richard Halverson was reading a brief his legal team had prepared. It was 3 pages long and covered his exposure on the incident in clinical, efficient language. He read it the way he read most things, quickly, retaining what mattered, dismissing what didn't. "Worst case?" he said. His lead attorney, a lean man named Clifton Pierce, adjusted his glasses. "Worst case, she files an assault complaint. It goes to the DA's office, and they decide it's worth pursuing based on witness count, which is notable." "What kind of witnesses?" "At least a dozen people were in that corridor, staff and visitors." Halverson leaned back in his chair. "Have we talked to the hospital administration?" "Yes, they're cooperative." "Good." He tapped the brief with one finger. "And her specifically, is there anything?" Halverson asked, setting his water glass down. "History? Complaints? Anything we can work with?" "She's clean. 9 years at Hargrove, no disciplinary record, well regarded by peers and physicians alike." Halverson absorbed this without reaction. "Then we shift the focus," he said. "I want the story to be about her conduct, blocking patient access, creating a hostile environment for a man whose associate needed urgent care. We don't need to win outright. We just need to muddy it enough that it's not worth her while to push forward." Clifton nodded and made a note. Halverson set the brief down and looked out at the river. He did not feel guilt. He felt, if anything, mild irritation, the kind you feel when a small obstruction requires more effort to clear than it reasonably should. On the 4th floor of Hargrove Medical Center, a nurse named Sandra Webb was doing something she had never done before in 19 years. She had pulled up the CCTV management system. She had access because she was the floor's incident coordinator, which came with administrative credentials most nurses didn't have, and she was making a copy. The file was time-stamped and clean. It showed the corridor from a high angle. Danielle near the ICU entrance, Halverson approaching, the exchange, the hand rising, the stumble, the wall. Sandra watched it twice. Her jaw was tight by the end of the second viewing. She thought about the 19 years she'd given this floor, thought about the charge nurses who'd come and gone, the politics she'd watched reshape the institution every time a new administrator arrived with new priorities and the same old language about accountability. She'd seen enough to know what happened to women like Danielle when the institution decided that protecting itself mattered more than protecting them. She saved the copy to a personal encrypted drive she kept in her locker, the same drive where she'd once stored documentation when a physician had covered up a medication error 3 years ago. She'd never had to use that footage. She had a feeling she was going to need this one. She closed the system and went back to her rounds, speaking to no one about it. Danielle's mother, Yvonne Carter, was 71 and moved through the world at a pace entirely her own, unhurried, observant, and sharp in the way that quiet people often are when they've spent decades listening more than talking. She had dinner waiting when Danielle came home that evening, pot roast, which she made on Tuesdays, and cornbread, which she made whenever she sensed that someone in her household needed comfort and didn't know how to ask for it. She had a sixth sense about that kind of thing. Danielle sat down at the table and ate with the performance of someone who was not doing well but was determined to appear otherwise. She talked about a patient who had recovered unexpectedly well from a respiratory infection. She commented on the cornbread. She asked about her mother's afternoon. Yvonne watched her daughter and said nothing about the careful way she was chewing on the left side, nothing about the faint shadow at the corner of her jaw, nothing about the fact that Danielle was holding her shoulders the way she held them when she was carrying something she hadn't decided what to do with yet. "You sleeping okay?" Yvonne asked instead, ladling more gravy without asking if Danielle wanted it. "Mostly," Danielle said. They ate in comfortable quiet for a while. The television in the living room was on at low volume, a nature documentary about migration patterns. "You know you don't have to handle everything by yourself," Yvonne said eventually. Her voice was casual, her eyes on her plate. "That's a thing people say, but I mean it specifically." Danielle looked at her. Her mother's face was turned slightly away, and Danielle knew that was deliberate, knew that Yvonne was giving her the option to receive it or deflect it without making eye contact the deciding factor. "I know, Mama," she said softly. She helped with the dishes afterward. She laughed at something her mother said about the documentary, something about how geese seemed to have more navigational sense than most people she'd worked with. She kissed her goodnight at 9:30 and went to her room. She sat on the bed and breathed slowly. The lamp on the nightstand threw a warm circle of light across the comforter. Outside, a car passed. A dog somewhere on the block barked twice and went quiet. The baby moved, a small, rolling pressure just below her ribs that she recognized now, its own little language. She'd been trying to learn it, the difference between a stretch and a kick, between restlessness and response. She pressed her hand there and felt the tightness in her lower back that had been building since the morning. Not the same as the morning before. She knew the difference between stress tension and something that needed clinical attention, but enough to make her take a slow inventory of how her body was doing. She was not okay. She would be, she thought, but tonight she was not. On Wednesday, Halverson came back to the hospital. And he arrived under the pretext of following up on his associate's treatment, which was a legitimate enough reason. Gordon Merritt was still admitted, his arm having required surgical attention for a deep laceration. But Halverson moved through the hospital the way a man moves through a space when he wants everyone in it to know he's not afraid of it. He spent 40 minutes in Gordon's room, then walked the corridor. He spoke loudly at the nurse's station about the quality of care, making pointed observations about wait times and administrative efficiency. When a young resident tried to explain a protocol, Halverson interrupted him twice, and then walked away mid-sentence. Danielle was not on the floor during most of this. She learned about it from Keisha, who described it with barely contained fury in the supply closet where they'd both retreated for a moment of quiet. He walked past where it happened like it was nothing, Keisha said, like he wanted everyone to see him doing that, like he was saying, nothing happened here. That's exactly what he was saying, Danielle said. Somebody should... I know, Danielle said. I know. She left the supply closet and returned to her patients. Dr. James Whitfield had been a hospitalist at Hargrove for 11 years and had developed over that time a reliable instinct for when something was wrong with the institution itself, not just with a patient, but with the building's invisible politics. He'd seen administrators cover for physicians. He'd seen funding influence triage protocols in ways that were never documented anywhere. He found Danielle near the end of her shift, pretending to review discharge papers at the far end of the nursing station. "How are you doing?" he asked, leaning against the counter at the appropriate not trying to crowd you angle. "Fine," she said. "I mean with all of it," he said. She looked at him. He was a tall man with a permanent slight worry crease between his brows, and the particular sincerity of someone who'd stopped performing professional distance sometime around his 40th birthday. "I'm okay," she said, more carefully this time. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that man has not been without consequences in other places. There's a physician at Memorial who filed a complaint 2 years ago about Halverson pressuring him to fast-track a family member's transplant evaluation. That complaint disappeared." Danielle was quiet. "I'm not telling you that to scare you," Dr. Whitfield said. "I'm telling you because you should know what you're dealing with. And because I don't think you should be dealing with it alone." "What happened to the physician?" Danielle asked. Dr. Whitfield's expression answered before his words did. "He left medicine." She nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." He straightened up, seemed about to say something else, then thought better of it and went back to his patients. That night, alone in the break room after everyone else had gone, Danielle pulled up the CCTV app on the break room's shared monitor. She knew the access codes. She was the floor's charge nurse, and the codes were for incident review. She found the timestamp and opened the file. She watched herself in the corridor. Watched the approach, the exchange, the hand. She had not seen it from the outside before. She had lived it from the inside, the heat, the stumble, the wall, the hand going to her stomach. Watching it from above and 20 feet away was a different experience entirely. From the outside, it looked like something that should have stopped the world. From the inside, she had somehow found a way to keep moving, which she now understood was both her greatest strength and the thing that people like Halverson counted on. It was brief. The whole thing was less than 90 seconds, and it was absolutely clear. She watched it 3 times. The third time, she felt something shift inside her. Something that had been sitting in the register of exhausted grief moved into something sharper. It wasn't rage, exactly. It was the thing that comes before a decision, the place where numbness gives way to clarity. She closed the application and sat for a moment. Then she took out her phone. She opened her contacts and found the name. Darius. Her thumb hovered over the call button. She thought about what it meant to call him, what it would pull him from, what it might cost him, what it said about her that she still felt the need to sort through those questions before she did the obvious thing. She pressed call. It rang 4 times. She was already pulling the phone from her ear, already cycling through the familiar justifications, the ones she'd been running since the morning it happened. He's deployed. He's focused. He doesn't need this. You can handle this yourself. You've always handled things yourself. She hung up. She sat with the deadline in her hand. The screen reflected her own face back at her. She put the phone in her pocket. She gathered her things. She turned off the break room light and walked back through the quiet hospital toward the exit. Outside, the air was cooler than she expected, mid-autumn cool, the kind that made the city feel briefly honest about what season it was. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her hand resting on her stomach, looking at the familiar street that looked, in this light, slightly unfamiliar. A bus rolled past a block over. A couple walked by on the opposite side, laughing about something, their voices bright and uncomplicated. She thought, not yet, but she also thought, but for the first time with any real weight behind it, with something that felt like resolve rather than resignation, something that felt less like endurance and more like the quiet outline of a different plan entirely. Soon. The envelope arrived on a Thursday. It was addressed to Hargrove Medical Center's legal department, but the contents, a formal letter of intent from the offices of Pierce and Whitmore, attorneys at law, made their way to Dr. Patricia Keene's desk by noon, and to the hospital's HR director by 2, and to Danielle's knowledge through the particular hospital grapevine that operated with the speed and precision of a well-run emergency room whenever the information was bad enough. The letter didn't name Danielle directly. It didn't have to. It referenced a staff altercation on the 4th floor and cited aggressive obstruction of a patient's representative attempting to access care, and it made clear in the measured language of people who got paid to make threats sound like observations that any formal complaint filed against Richard Halverson would be met with a counterfiling that would prove both costly and damaging to the reputations of those involved. Danielle read a summary of it from Keisha, who'd heard it from Derek, who'd overheard 2 administrators talking in the elevator with their voices lower than they should have been. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table after her mother had gone to bed, and she did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She sat with the anger, not the managed professional version she carried through her shifts, but the real thing, the kind that has no outlet and no protocol and no resolution you can chart in a patient file. She sat with it until it had burned through the worst of itself, and then she made a cup of tea she didn't drink, and she went to bed. The next morning, she was called into a meeting with HR Director Todd Brennan, a soft-spoken man with careful eyes who wore his discomfort like a second collar. He presented it as concern, as support. He used the phrase exploring options 3 times in 15 minutes, and the phrase your well-being is our priority twice. What he was offering, beneath the careful language, was a settlement, a number that was probably meant to feel generous, a non-disclosure clause with specific carve-outs that looked reasonable until you read the fine print, and a paragraph that described the incident in neutral terms so scrubbed of specificity that it would tell nobody anything. The hospital's general counsel had apparently already reviewed the draft. Todd had a copy on his desk, face down, that he hadn't offered her yet. "We're not asking you to say nothing happened," Todd said, straightening a pen that didn't need straightening. "We're asking you to let the institution manage the resolution in a way that's fair to all parties." "You mean let the institution make it go away," she said. Her voice was even. She had learned over years of delivering hard news to patients and families how to keep her voice even when everything underneath it was not. Todd's expression was pained. "Danielle, he struck me," she said, "while I was pregnant, on a hospital floor in front of a dozen witnesses." "Oh, and you're sitting here with a document a Billionaire's legal team has already had input on, asking me to sign something that says the institution managed it." Todd opened his mouth, closed it again. "We're asking you to consider what's best for everyone involved," he said finally. She looked at him for a long moment. He had the decency to look away first. "I'll think about it," she said. She picked up her bag and left. She did not think about it. She had already made her decision sitting at that kitchen table the night before, though she hadn't named it yet. The settlement offer didn't change anything. It only clarified it. Sandra found her in the medication room just after noon. She didn't say anything at first. She just checked that the hallway was clear, closed the door partway, and held out a small USB drive between two fingers. Danielle looked at it. "Sandra, it's a copy," Sandra said. "Full corridor footage, time-stamped, nothing edited. I made it the morning after." She paused. "I wasn't sure you'd want it. I wasn't sure of a lot of things. But then I heard about the settlement offer, and I figured you should at least have the option to decide what to do with it yourself." Danielle took the drive. It was small and light, barely there in her palm. "You could lose your job for this," Danielle said. "I could," Sandra said simply. "But I've been a nurse for 19 years, and the reason I stayed that long is because I believed this place was worth staying for. If I let this get buried without doing something, then I don't know what I've been staying for." Danielle closed her fingers around the drive. "Thank you," she said. Sandra straightened up and moved toward the door. "I go home at 7. After that, I don't know anything about any USB drive." She glanced back once, and there was something in her expression that wasn't quite a smile, but held the same warmth. Then she was gone. The whispers started that same week. Danielle couldn't trace them back to a source, but she didn't have to. She recognized the architecture of them, the way conversations shifted when she walked into a room, the way a cluster of staff near the station dispersed a little too naturally, the way a physician she'd worked with for 3 years suddenly seemed to have trouble meeting her eyes in the corridor, finding something urgently interesting on his phone whenever their paths crossed. Someone was managing the narrative, not loudly. Loudly would have been easier to confront. You can respond to something direct. This was the quieter kind, the kind that moved through a workplace like a slow leak, filling spaces with doubt before anyone realized the water was rising. It was designed to make her seem like the problem, like the person who had created disruption, like the one whose emotion and refusal to accept a reasonable resolution was making everyone's lives harder. She caught a fragment of it on Friday, from 2 nurses she didn't know well, speaking in the stairwell 2 floors below where they thought she was. Something about her being difficult. Something about how administration had tried to handle it fairly and she'd refused to cooperate. Something about whether someone that emotional should be working with patients in her condition, delivered not with cruelty, but with the particular tone of people who believe they're expressing reasonable concern while doing the work of someone else's agenda. She stood on the landing and breathed slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Then she went back upstairs and spent the next 2 hours being the best nurse on that floor because it was the only response she had that mattered. She pulled up Darius's contact that evening. She pressed call. She listened to it ring once, twice, 3 times, and then she lost her nerve and ended it. She sat on her bed with the phone in her lap and her hand over her baby and made herself acknowledge out loud in the quiet of her room that she was scared. Not of what Halverson would do, but of what calling Darius would mean. Of dragging him out of whatever dangerous, purposeful life he was living and into hers, which suddenly felt very small and very complicated. She gave herself exactly 5 minutes to sit with that fear. She'd learned the technique from a grief counselor she'd seen briefly after her father died. 5 minutes, fully felt. Then you move. She picked up the phone. It rang twice. "Danny." His voice was immediate, alert, carrying that quality it always had of being completely present, like he had been waiting, or at least not surprised. "Hey," she said, and then, despite herself, her voice cracked at the edges. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just him reading the sound of her. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Not everything at once. It came out in the order it had happened. Slowly at first, and then faster, the way a dam doesn't fail all at once. The shift, Halverson, the hallway, the hand, the settlement offer, the whispers, the USB drive in her nightstand drawer. She tried to keep her voice even. She mostly managed it. When she finished, there was a pause. "Darius," she started. "I'm coming home," he said. Not a question, not something she could argue with. Just a fact, delivered the way he delivered most things. Quietly, with the finality of something already decided. "You don't have to—" "Danielle." His voice was gentle but immovable. "I'm coming home." She let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest since the morning it happened. She hadn't known it was there until it left. "Okay," she said. He came on a Tuesday, 4 days later, and on a flight she hadn't booked, and in clothes she'd never seen. Dark jeans, a plain gray jacket, a single duffel bag that looked like it had been through more countries than most people visit. He looked like someone who had learned to carry exactly what he needed and nothing else. She met him in the hospital parking lot on her lunch break because it was the only time she had, and also because some part of her wanted him to see where it had happened before she had to explain any more of it in words. He got out of the ride chair and stood in front of her, and for a moment they just looked at each other the way siblings do when they haven't been in the same room for too long. Taking stock, recalibrating, reading the ways the other person has changed without either of them meaning to. He looked older, not in a bad way. I'd in the way that people look when they've been somewhere that required everything of them and they came back having given it, steadier somehow, like weight that has been distributed more evenly. "You look tired," he said. "You look like you need a sandwich," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not a smile exactly, something close to one. He pulled her into a hug carefully, one arm around her shoulders, his hand at the back of her head, the other arm just barely touching her back in deference to the belly between them. She felt the tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders release slightly, just from the physical fact of him being there. Not because he was going to fix anything, because she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. They stood like that for a long moment. "Okay," he said when they stepped apart, and his voice was the same as she remembered, low, unhurried, carrying that quality of someone who had learned that you didn't need to fill silence to command it. "Walk me through it." He did not go to the hospital that first day. He spent the afternoon in her apartment at her kitchen table with a legal pad and her account of everything. He asked questions she didn't expect, specific ones, the kind that made her realize he was building a structure in his mind rather than simply absorbing a story. What time exactly had the incident occurred? How many staff members had been present, and in what positions? What the hospital's formal reporting window was under its own employment policy. Whether she had anything in writing from HR. "You said Sandra made a copy," he said. "She gave it to me. I have it. Have you watched it all the way through? Not just the incident, the full file beginning to end? I watched the incident portion. Watch the whole thing, he said. Sometimes context matters. He wrote something on his legal pad. And the nurse who gave it to you, Sandra, is she solid? She's the most reliable person on that floor. He nodded slowly. I want to go to the hospital. Not today. I want to understand the layout first, the event schedule, who's there and when, how Halverson moves through the space. He doesn't have a fixed schedule, Danielle said. He comes when he feels like it. People like him always have a rhythm, Darius said. They just think they don't. He visited Hargrove for the first time on Thursday morning, during a window when Danielle was on shift and could give him a reason to be there. He was listed in the visitor system as a family member visiting Gordon Merritt's floor, which was technically adjacent and required no special clearance. He moved through the building the way he moved through most environments, unhurried, observant, taking up exactly as much space as necessary and no more. He had learned over years of working in places where reading an environment incorrectly had real consequences, how to look like he belonged somewhere without announcing it. He noted the exits, 4 on the main floor, 2 on the 4th, 1 service exit near the east stairwell that opened to the loading dock. He noted camera placements, solid coverage in the main corridor, a dead angle near the family waiting area. He's another near the elevator bank on the 2nd floor. He noted which staff members moved with the confidence of people who felt secure in their environment, and which ones carried the particular tension of people managing something they hadn't been given permission to talk about. He could tell the difference. He'd spent years in environments where that distinction mattered. He noted the corner where the corridor widened near the ICU entrance, where it had happened, and stood there for a moment, looking at the wall. The paint was unmarked. The floor showed nothing. The hallway looked exactly like every other part of the hospital. He stood there anyway. He said nothing about what he felt. He rarely did. On the way out, he passed the administration wing and paused outside a door marked Office of the Chief of Medical Staff. He checked his watch. He straightened his jacket, and then he knocked. Dr. Patricia Keene looked up from her desk with the expression of someone who did not appreciate unscheduled visitors and was preparing to say so. "My name is Darius Carter," he said from the doorway. "Danielle Carter is my sister. I was hoping to have a brief conversation." Dr. Keene studied him. Something in his bearing made her recalibrate before she spoke. The stillness of him, maybe, or the particular quality of his eye contact, which was direct without being aggressive, which somehow made it harder to dismiss. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "I understand this is a difficult situation for your family." "I'm not here to make it difficult," he said. "I'm here to understand what steps the institution is taking to protect a member of its staff who was assaulted on the premises." The word assaulted sat in the room. "There is an ongoing process," she began. "The ongoing process," Darius said, "appears to involve offering my pregnant sister a settlement with a non-disclosure clause." He said it without heat, simply the way you describe weather. "I'm not sure that constitutes protection." Dr. Keene's expression shifted, not quite fear, but the alertness of someone who had just realized the conversation they were having was not the conversation they'd expected to be having. "I should let you know," Darius said, "that I have some familiarity with institutional accountability processes. I've operated in environments where oversight matters considerably." He paused. "Why, I mention that only because I want you to know that I'm aware of what proper procedure looks like, and I'll be watching to see how close this comes to it." He left that sentence in the room without finishing it, then thanked her for her time and walked out. In the elevator going down, he made a note on his phone. Keen knows more than she's acted on. She's not hostile. She's afraid. That's useful. Sandra Webb was eating lunch alone in the break room on Friday when Darius found her. Danielle had described her exactly. 19-year veteran, gray-streaked locks, the particular quality of calm that comes from having seen too much and chosen to stay anyway. He introduced himself. She looked at him for a moment, the way people look at someone when they're deciding whether to trust them on instinct or make them earn it. "Why, Danielle talks about you," she said finally. "Good things, I hope." "She worries about you," Sandra said. "That's as good as it gets from her." He sat down across from her. "She tells me you kept the footage." "She tell you what it cost me to do that?" "She told me it was a risk." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "They've been dropping hints about my hours. Nothing official. Just the kind of things that happen when administration wants someone to feel unwelcome without having to document why." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not backing down, but I want you to know what we're dealing with." "I do," Darius said, "and I want you to know that what you did matters, not just to Danielle, to how this ends." Something in Sandra's posture shifted, not softening exactly, but settling, like a building that has just been told its foundation is sound. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Right now, just keep doing what you're doing. Don't escalate. Don't retreat. Stay steady." He paused. "When the time comes, I may need you to be willing to speak on the record, not now, but eventually." "I figured as much," she said. She looked at her lunch. "You want a sandwich?" "I made 2. He did, actually. He hadn't eaten since morning. Danielle found him that evening on the fire escape of her apartment, which was where he'd always gone when they were growing up, and he needed to think. Same fire escape, different building. He'd picked the habit back up the moment he'd set down his bag. He had a coffee that had gone cold and his legal pad, now covered on 3 pages with neat compressed notes that she couldn't quite read from where she stood. "You're building a case," she said, leaning against the railing beside him. The city moved below them, traffic, voices, the distant horn of something on the river. "I'm building clarity," he corrected. "A case is what comes after. Right now, I'm making sure I understand what I'm looking at." "And what are you looking at?" He was quiet for a moment. "A man who's never been told no in a way that actually landed, who's surrounded himself with people whose job is to make problems disappear, who's made the mistake, a few times before you, of assuming that everyone who doesn't fight back is incapable of it." He tapped his pen against the pad. "He doesn't know what he walked into when he walked into that hallway." "And what did he walk into?" Danielle asked. Darius looked at her. "You," he said simply. "He walked into you." She didn't know what to say to that. She looked out at the city instead. "Is there an after?" she said after a moment. "There is," he said, "but I need one more thing." He turned to look at her. "There's a hospital fundraiser, high profile, next Friday. The Cardiology Gala. Halverson's Foundation is one of the sponsors." "I know." He looked back at his legal pad. "I need you to get me in." Danielle was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on her stomach. "Darius, I don't want this to get—" "I know what you're worried about," he said. "Then tell me you've thought about it." "I've thought about nothing else since you called." He turned back to her, and his voice was the same as it always was when he was most serious. Quieter, not louder, like something with gravity pulling inward rather than pushing out. "I'm not going to do anything impulsive. I'm not going to do anything that makes things harder for you or puts you or the baby at more risk. I just need him to see me. In a room full of people he respects, I need him to feel watched. That's it?" "That's the first part," he said honestly. She looked at him for a long time. She knew that face, had known it her whole life, the version of it that was completely decided without being closed, that could still hear her, but had already done its work. "Okay," she said finally. He went back to his notes. She stayed beside him a little longer, looking out at the city, her hand over her baby, the night cool around them both. She got him on the list through Dr. Whitfield, who owed her nothing but offered anyway when she explained in the broadest terms what she needed. A guest pass, a name on the gala registration, access to the event floor. Dr. Whitfield asked no questions, which she appreciated more than she could say. On the night of the gala, Darius dressed carefully. Dark suit, no tie. He looked like a man who belonged in that room without looking like a man who was trying to. He arrived 20 minutes before Halverson's expected entrance, found a position near the center of the room with clear sight lines in all directions, and stood still. When Halverson walked through the doors 40 minutes later, confident, attended, moving through his preferred world with the ease of someone who had never had to earn an entrance, he was already scanning the room the way powerful men do, cataloging who was there, whose attention he held, who he'd need to acknowledge, and who he could afford to ignore. It was a habit so old and automatic he likely didn't know he was doing it anymore. He found Darius by accident, the way you find a rock in a dark room, not by looking for it, but by running into it. Their eyes met across the gala floor. Halverson didn't stop walking, but something in him shifted just slightly. A barely perceptible hesitation in his stride, a recalibration behind his eyes that was visible only if you were looking for it, and Darius was always looking for it. Something about the way Darius was standing, the stillness of him, the fact that he was looking at Halverson the way almost no one ever looked at Richard Halverson, without wanting anything from him, without deference, without calculation, without any of the social signals Halverson had spent decades learning to read and manage. No admiration, no resentment, no performance, just steady, quiet attention. The kind that doesn't look away when you look back. Halverson looked away. He greeted someone nearby with the practiced warmth of a man who had written the script for warmth. He laughed at something, too easily, half a beat too fast. He moved toward the bar with the studied ease of a man performing ease for an audience that wasn't quite watching him the way he wanted to be watched. But he did not smile. For the first time in as long as any of his staff could remember, in a room full of people who existed to validate him, Richard Halverson did not smile. Darius watched him and said nothing. He didn't need to. The evening had already done what he needed it to do. Across the room, Danielle stood near the east wall, her hand resting on her stomach, her eyes moving between her brother and the man who had put her against a wall and walked away like it was nothing. She watched Halverson not smile, and she felt, for the first time since it happened, something that wasn't fear or anger or exhaustion. She felt the balance beginning, slowly and quite deliberately, to shift. The cardiology gala had the particular energy of rooms where money and medicine overlap, a careful cheerfulness, the kind that exists because everyone present has agreed, without saying so, that tonight is about something other than the hard realities that brought the building into existence in the first place. Crystal glasses, low lighting that made the space feel warmer than it was. A string quartet near the far wall playing something that no one was quite listening to, but that everyone appreciated being able to ignore. Waitstaff moving in smooth ellipses with trays of things people didn't need, but took anyway, because accepting something offered is easier than declining it. Darius had been standing near the center of the room for 31 minutes when Halverson walked in. He had not moved much in that time. He'd accepted a glass of water from a passing tray, finished it, set it down. He'd spoken briefly to a cardiologist who'd introduced himself unprompted, a gregarious man who recognized Darius as someone who belonged there without being able to say why, and moved on when the conversation didn't offer him anything to hold. Darius had that effect on people in rooms like this one. But he looked like he had been to rooms exactly like this before, which was true, and like he had nothing to prove in them, which was also true. And those two things combined produced a quality that people in rooms like this found simultaneously reassuring and unsettling. They couldn't decide if he was someone they should know, and that uncertainty made them careful around him. He felt Danielle at the edge of the room before he saw her. A peripheral awareness, the same kind he'd developed over years of operating in environments where knowing where everyone was mattered. She was near the east wall, one hand resting on her stomach, her expression composed in that particular way she'd had since they were children, the face she put on when she was managing more than she let show. He kept his eyes on the door. Halverson entered with two people flanking him, not bodyguards, just the natural orbit of a man who attracted attendance. He was in a dark suit, his silver hair precisely in place, moving through the room's entrance the way he moved through every room, like the space had been arranged in anticipation of his arrival. He shook two hands in the first 30 seconds. He laughed at something before he'd even fully cleared the entryway. Then his eyes found Darius. It happened in less than a second, that particular recalibration that Darius had been watching for. Not alarm, not recognition, just the faint signal of a man whose instincts were telling him something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. Halverson's smile didn't vanish. It continued, carried forward by social momentum. But it lost something underneath, some of its ease, some of the automatic quality that made it look effortless. Darius didn't move. He simply continued to look at him. Halverson looked away. He greeted someone to his left, enthusiastically, leaning into the interaction with a warmth that was practiced but not entirely fake. He was good at this room. He had been working rooms like this for 30 years. He moved through the next 10 minutes with the competence of a man who knew exactly how to make himself the gravitational center of any space he occupied. But twice in those 10 minutes, his eyes came back to Darius, unbidden. And both times, Darius was already looking at him. It was not a staring contest. It was not aggressive. It was simply sustained, patient attention, the kind that doesn't perform itself, doesn't announce itself, just continues. Or the kind that powerful men almost never experience, because the people around them have learned that sustained attention directed at them without warmth is dangerous. Darius had no such calculation to make. After the second time, Halverson said something to the man beside him, laughed again, and then began, very naturally, to move in a direction that would eventually bring him to the bar, which happened to be near where Darius was standing. Darius let him come. Halverson ordered a drink, stood with his back 3/4 turned, giving the impression of casualness. Then, without looking directly at him, as though the words were incidental, "You've been watching me since I walked in." "I have," Darius said. Halverson turned then. Up close he was physically imposing, broad through the shoulders, it with the particular confidence of a man who had never had a reason to make himself smaller. He looked at Darius the way he'd looked at Danielle in the corridor, like he was deciding what category to put him in. "Should I know you?" Halverson said. "Darius Carter," he said. "Danielle's brother." Something moved through Halverson's expression, fast, there and gone. Not guilt, something more like the recognition of a variable he hadn't accounted for. "I see," he said. He took a slow sip of his drink. "I imagine you're here to tell me something." "I'm here to show you something first," Darius said. He reached into his jacket and produced a tablet. Slim. No case. He set it on the bar between them. Screen already active, the footage already loaded to the right timestamp. He didn't press play immediately. He looked at Halverson. "I'd like you to watch this privately," Darius said, "before we continue." Halverson looked at the tablet. He recognized the angle immediately. The high hallway camera, the fourth-floor corridor, the timestamp in the upper corner. He'd known footage existed. His legal team had known. They had calculated, with reasonable confidence, that the hospital would manage it, that institutional self-interest would do what direct pressure didn't need to. He watched himself on the screen for 45 seconds. He watched the approach, the exchange, the hand, the stumble, the wall. He watched Danielle's hand go to her stomach. He watched himself walk away. He watched it without expression, or rather, without any expression that Darius could fully read, which was itself a kind of expression. When it ended, Halverson set his drink down. "My attorneys are already—" "I know what your attorneys are doing," Darius said. "That's not why I'm showing you this." "Then why?" "Because I want you to have seen it, clearly, before anything else happens." He picked up the tablet and put it back in his jacket. "I want you to be a person who has looked at that and knows exactly what it is." Halverson straightened. The composed version of him reasserted itself, the one that had survived boardrooms and negotiations and 30 years of being the most powerful person in most rooms he entered. "If you're threatening me," he said, "you should know that I have resources you cannot—" "I'm not threatening you," Darius said. "I'm informing you." He kept his voice at the same level it had been since the beginning of the conversation, even unhurried, with no performance of anger. "The footage isn't the only thing. There are witnesses whose accounts have been formally documented. There are records of communication between your legal team and this hospital's administration. There are prior incidents at other institutions that people have been reluctant to put their names to, until recently." Something shifted in Halverson's jaw. "Not much. Enough." "You're building a case," he said. "I told you," Darius said. "I'm building clarity." Nearby, the string quartet shifted into something slightly slower. A woman in a green dress laughed at something near the window. The room continued its careful cheerfulness, entirely unaware of the conversation at the bar. Halverson looked at Darius for a long moment. The first time, Darius thought, that he was actually looking at him rather than calculating him. "Oh, what is it that you want?" Halverson said, not aggressive, almost curious. "I want the same thing my sister wanted when she was standing in that corridor," Darius said. "For you to be treated like someone who did something wrong." He paused. "That's all?" Halverson's expression settled into something harder. "I'll have my attorneys contact whoever you need them to contact," he said. "I'll bury this so completely that—" "You thought you walked away that day," Darius said quietly, "but you walked into something else." He said it without drama, without emphasis. Just stated it, the way you state a fact about weather or distance, and then he picked up his water glass and turned slightly away, signaling without rudeness that the conversation was over for now. Halverson stood at the bar for another moment. Then he walked back into the room. He smiled at 3 people in the next 5 minutes. Each one was slightly less convincing than the last. Across the room, Danielle had watched the whole exchange from the east wall. She couldn't hear a word of it. She had watched Halverson approach, watched the conversation, watched the tablet come out and go away, watched Darius's posture, never shifting, never forward, always that same grounded stillness. Watched Halverson walk back into the room. The smile, the way it was working harder than it used to. She felt something loosen in her chest, not resolution, It was too early for that, but something. The first indication that gravity was moving in a different direction. She placed her hand on her stomach and exhaled slowly. Around her, the gala continued. The quartet played. People networked and donated and felt good about themselves in the way that charity events are designed to facilitate. No one else in the room knew that anything had happened at the bar. But Halverson knew, and Darius knew, and Danielle, watching from across the room, knew. That was enough. For tonight, that was exactly enough. The morning after the gala, Darius sat at Danielle's kitchen table with 3 legal pads and a cold cup of coffee and the quiet, methodical energy of someone who had spent years in environments where preparation was the difference between outcomes. He had been awake since 5. He was used to early mornings. They had been part of his life long enough that sleeping past 6 felt like a loss of something he couldn't name. Danielle had found him there when she came out at 6:30, moving carefully in her robe with the deliberate balance of a woman navigating the last weeks of pregnancy, and they'd shared the first half hour in the comfortable silence of people who had grown up understanding that not all quiet needed filling. She made eggs. He ate them without comment, which was as close as he got to gratitude when he was in the middle of thinking through something. "How do you know who to call?" she asked at some point, watching him work through his notes. He looked up. "What do you mean?" "You said at the gala there were prior incidents, other institutions. You said people had been reluctant to put their names to things, until recently." She looked at him steadily. "How recently?" He was quiet for a moment. "I started making calls the day you told me," he said. "People talk to people. People in my line of work have contacts in a lot of places, and people who've been wronged and told to stay quiet are usually waiting for someone to call who seems like they're actually going to do something." Danielle absorbed that. "How many people?" "Enough," he said. He looked back at his notes. "Enough that this is no longer just about what happened to you." She'd known this, intellectually, since the gala, but hearing it plainly named made it feel different, heavier, more real. She sat with it over her coffee and thought about what it meant to be part of a pattern, to be the one moment in a long series of moments that had simply had the bad luck or the fortune, depending on how you looked at it, of happening at the right time. Darius had reached out through channels she didn't fully understand, former colleagues. People who owed him nothing but helped anyway, because of the particular currency that builds up between people who have trusted each other in difficult places. Not favors exactly. More like the recognition that some things are worth doing regardless of what they cost, and that people who have operated in environments where that principle is tested tend to identify each other quickly. One contact was a journalist at a regional outlet who had been sitting on a piece about Halverson's hospital contracts for 8 months, waiting for a human story to anchor it, the kind of story that has all its facts assembled, but can't move because facts without faces don't travel the same way. Another was a former administrator at a medical facility in another state who had documented Halverson's interference in departmental decisions over a period of 2 years and then been quietly pushed out with a settlement of her own, a number large enough to make silence feel like the practical choice. She had been reconsidering that choice for some time. Darius's call had given her a reason to act on it. None of it had broken publicly yet. It was all still in the architecture stage, pieces being placed, support structures being checked and rechecked. Darius was not impulsive. He had learned, in places where impulsiveness had consequences that couldn't be undone, the discipline of waiting until the structure was sound before you asked it to hold anything. But the pieces were there. Danielle was on shift 4 days after the gala when she noticed the change. It was subtle, The way things were subtle when they were reversing rather than escalating, not a single event you could point to, but a shift in the texture of the air, in the small behaviors that accumulate into a workplace's daily character. A physician she hadn't spoken to in weeks stopped her in the corridor to ask how she was doing, genuinely, looking at her directly, waiting for an actual answer rather than accepting the reflexive fine. Two nurses who had been avoiding her eye contact resumed it. One of them, passing the nurses' station, touched her arm briefly as she went by, just briefly, but deliberately, and Danielle recognized it for what it was. An acknowledgement, a quiet alignment. Todd Brennan, the HR director, she walked past the nurses' station mid-morning and nodded at her with an expression that was trying to communicate something, but hadn't quite found the language yet. She didn't help him find it. She nodded back and returned to her chart. The whisper campaign hadn't vanished overnight, but it had lost momentum. Narratives need feeding. They require a consistent source of energy and a belief from the people carrying them that the story is moving in the right direction. This one had been running on Halverson's confidence and the hospital administration's fear, and both of those things were quietly less abundant than they'd been 2 weeks ago. Sandra noticed it too, and said so. "Something's shifting," she said, finding Danielle in the break room during a quiet window between patients. She had her own coffee, her own expression of measured, careful observation, the look of someone who has been watching institutional weather patterns long enough to read them accurately. "I don't know what your brother did or said at that gala, but the temperature in this building has changed." "He had a conversation," Danielle said. "Must have been some conversation." "He's good at them," Danielle said. "He doesn't use many words, but the ones he uses land where he means them to." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then, "Administration is talking, privately, but talking. I think they're starting to realize the settlement offer made things worse, not better. It left a paper trail that implies they knew something needed settling." Danielle looked at her coffee. "They did know." "Yes," Sandra said. "They did." The shift ended. Danielle drove home, and somewhere on the quiet stretch of road between the hospital and her mother's street, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in weeks. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. The particular relief of a person who has been holding everything alone and has finally, genuinely, begun to share the weight. She got the call from a number she didn't recognize on a Wednesday afternoon. The voice on the other end was measured, professional, a woman named Carol Ashby, who identified herself as a journalist and explained briefly that she was working on a piece that touched on Hargrove Medical Center and its relationship with certain funding partners, and that she had come across Danielle's name in the context of a workplace incident. Danielle stood in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and her free hand flat on the counter, steadying herself. "How did you get my name?" she said. "I can't say specifically," Carol said, "but I want you to know I'm not calling to put anything in print that you haven't consented to. I'm calling because I believe your account is important to a story that's larger than one incident, and I'd like you to decide whether you want to be part of telling it." Danielle was quiet for a long moment. "I'll call you back," she said. She hung up and immediately called Darius. "Was that you?" she said when he answered. A pause. "I made an introduction," he said carefully. "I didn't give her your number. I gave her a direction." "Darius?" "She's credible," he said. "She's been working on Halverson's contracts for 8 months. She has documents. She has former employees on record. What she doesn't have is what happened at the hospital, the human part." He paused. "You don't have to talk to her. This works either way, But if you want your voice in it, your actual voice, she's the right person to talk to. Danielle stood in her kitchen for a long time after she hung up. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a kid on the street below rode past on a bicycle, calling something to someone she couldn't see. She thought about the settlement document with its careful, neutral language. She thought about Todd Brennan's face when she'd asked him whether this meeting would be happening if she weren't pregnant. She thought about the two nurses in the stairwell and the way they delivered concern as a weapon, and about the physician who'd stopped meeting her eyes, and about the way the hospital floor had gone absolutely silent when Halverson walked away and left her against a wall with her hand on her stomach. She thought about the fact that somewhere, in another state, there was probably a woman who had experienced something adjacent to what she'd experienced and had signed something and gone quiet, and that the silence had cost her something she wouldn't fully measure for years. She thought about how a pattern works, how it requires each individual moment to remain separate and unnamed, because separate moments are manageable and a pattern is not. She was tired. She was 32 weeks pregnant. Her feet hurt and her back hurt, and she had a shift in 14 hours. Though she had every legitimate reason to let this belong to someone else, to let the journalist do her work without Danielle's name attached, to let Darius handle the structural parts, to protect her energy for the child she was about to bring into the world. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about the corridor, the wall, the hand on her stomach that had gone there not in pain, but in protection, before she even knew what her body was doing. She called Carol Ashby back. Halverson's response came within 48 hours. Danielle didn't see it directly. She heard about it through Keisha, who had seen it, and through Dr. Whitfield, who had received a more official version of it. Halverson's team had begun circulating a counter-narrative, this time more aggressively than before. And not the quiet whispers, but something with more shape to it. Statements being floated to people in the hospital's orbit, suggesting that Danielle was unstable, that her complaints were emotionally driven, that her pregnancy had compromised her professional judgment. It was louder than the first campaign, which meant it was more scared. Darius, when she told him, simply nodded. "Good," he said. She looked at him. "Good?" When someone who's been calm starts making noise, it's because they feel the ground moving under them, he said. He's not doing this from strength. He's doing it because the other things aren't working. She wasn't entirely reassured. She was 32 weeks pregnant. Her body ached with the specific persistence of someone who had been managing stress for too long. She sat down at the kitchen table across from him and pressed her palms flat on its surface. "I'm tired, Darius," she said, not defeated, just honest. He looked at her for a moment. "I know. I'm not saying stop. I'm just saying—" She stopped, started again. "I need to know that whatever happens, my child is okay, that I'm okay, that this doesn't take more than I have left." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've already done the hardest part. You stayed standing when he expected you to collapse. You kept your job and your patience and your reputation when he tried to take all three. What's coming is not going to require that kind of strength from you." He looked at her steadily. "You just have to keep being exactly who you are." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she exhaled slowly and nodded. Sandra Webb was called into a formal meeting on a Thursday morning with 2 members of hospital administration and what appeared to be an outside HR consultant. The meeting was in a small conference room on the administrative floor, not the kind of room where good news gets delivered. The concerns they raised were worded carefully, the kind of careful that is designed to imply seriousness without providing anything specific enough to contest. Her hours, her performance record over recent weeks, Several ambiguously phrased concerns about her conduct in relation to internal documents and procedures. She sat across the table from three people who were not quite looking at her directly, and she understood immediately what this was. She had been in nursing long enough to recognize an institutional maneuver when it was sitting across a table from her. She went in alone. She came out 40 minutes later, sat down at the nurse's station with her hands flat on its surface for a moment, and then called Darius's number for the first time on her own initiative. "They're trying to build a case to terminate me," she said when he answered. "They haven't said it directly, but I know what a paper trail being constructed looks like." "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" Darius said. "I'm calling you first." "Call a lawyer today. I'll give you a name." He paused. "Sandra, you have 19 years of documented performance. They built this paper trail starting 3 weeks ago. The timeline itself is the evidence." Another pause. "And I want you to know what you did with that footage matters. When everything is fully in the open, your role in it will matter." Sandra sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "All right, give me the name." She wrote it down, put her phone in her pocket, and went back to her patients. 4 days after Danielle's conversation with Carol Ashby, Halverson sat in his 47th floor office and read through a brief that was notably different from the ones he'd been reading over the past few weeks. This one concerned a formal complaint filed by a former administrator at Meridian Health Partners in another state, someone who had been quiet for 2 years, who had documentation, and who had now attached her name to a statement. It concerned a financial audit that had been quietly requested by 2 members of Hargrove's board, apparently acting independently, but with identical concerns about contract irregularities tied to Halverson's foundation. It concerned a journalist who had made a formal records request 3 days ago for documents related to Halverson's involvement in hospital procurement decisions going back 5 years. And it concerned the CCTV footage, which his legal team had assumed was contained within the hospital's administrative structure. It was not contained. A copy existed outside the hospital. His team had known this was a possibility. They had not acted on it quickly enough. Clifton Pierce sat across the desk, his expression carrying the particular professional neutrality of a lawyer who has learned over decades to deliver bad news without performing discomfort. Yet he had the quality of a man who had sat in many offices like this one and delivered many briefs like this one, and who had long since stopped expecting the people across the desk to take it well. "The complaint from Meridian," Halverson said, "filed yesterday, formally, with supporting documentation going back 18 months. And the board members, acting within their authority. We can't block the audit request, and attempting to do so would create additional exposure." Halverson was quiet. He turned his chair slightly toward the window and looked out at the river, which was gray today, flat and unreflective under a low sky. The kind of river that looked permanent, unmoved by what happened on its banks. He thought about the man at the bar, the stillness of him, the way he'd said, "You walked into something else." At the time, B. Halverson had filed it as the posturing of a protective relative, someone with emotion and no architecture behind it, someone who could be managed the same way everything else had been managed. He understood now that it had not been posturing. The architecture had been there from the beginning. He simply hadn't been able to see it. "What's our exposure?" he said. Clifton paused before answering, which was itself an answer. "Broader than we initially modeled," he said carefully, "and growing." Halverson nodded once, slowly. He kept looking at the river. For the first time in a very long time, in a room that had always felt like the center of everything, he felt the room's edges pressing inward. He had been wrong about the nurse. He had been catastrophically, completely wrong about her brother. And somewhere below him, in a city that was continuing entirely without his permission, the consequences of both mistakes were moving through their natural course, methodical, unhurried, entirely beyond his ability to contain. Outside his window, the gray river moved in its indifferent, unhurried way. Clifton was still talking. Halverson had stopped listening. He was thinking about a corridor, a wall, a hand, a single moment that had taken less than 2 seconds, and that was now, apparently, far from finished with him. The footage appeared online on a Tuesday morning, and by noon it had been viewed over 200,000 times. Danielle found out about it the way most people find out about things that have happened in the world before they've had their second cup of coffee, through the particular quality of her phone going off. Not the ordinary cadence of morning notifications, spaced and manageable, but something more clustered, more insistent. The kind of pattern that means multiple people have seen something at the same time and reached for her name. Keisha called first, her voice high and fast, words tripping over each other. Then Dr. Whitfield sent a message with a link and 3 words. It's out there. Then Sandra, 2 minutes after that, with a message that said only, "Are you okay?" Then her mother appeared in the kitchen doorway, with her own phone held up, face turned toward Danielle, expression impossible to fully read at that distance, but carrying something that landed somewhere between alarm and something older. The expression of a woman who had been watching her daughter carry something heavy and was watching the weight finally begin to move. Danielle sat down at the kitchen table and watched it. She had seen it before, of course. She had watched it alone in the break room on the hospital monitor. She had watched it at home on her laptop, the light from the screen, the only light in the room. She knew every second of it, the approach, the exchange, the hand, the stumble, the wall, the way her own hand had gone to her stomach before her face had registered anything at all. But watching it in this context, with a view counterclimbing in real time, with comments populating beneath it from people who hadn't been there and were reacting to what they saw with the unfiltered immediacy of strangers, was a different experience. It was no longer hers alone. It had entered the larger world, and the larger world was answering. She felt strangely calm, not detached, not numb, just settled. Like the part of her that had been bracing for this moment could finally release, because the moment had arrived and she was still standing, and the ground beneath her had not changed. She didn't know who had released the footage. She didn't ask Darius when he appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later with his jacket on. He sat down across from her, and she looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything about it directly. "Carol Ashby's piece goes live this afternoon," he said. "She called an hour ago." Danielle nodded. She had spoken to Carol twice in the preceding weeks, one long interview and one follow-up call to verify specific details. She had told her account plainly and completely in her own words, without editorial shaping. But Carol had been professional in exactly the way that good journalists are. She asked questions that made Danielle uncomfortable, because the uncomfortable questions were the important ones, and she didn't flinch when the answers were complicated. "Are you ready?" Darius said. Danielle thought about the word. Ready implied a kind of preparation that didn't quite describe what she felt. She had been living inside this for weeks. She had been tired and scared and angry and resolved and tired again. She had carried it through every shift, every patient interaction, every dinner with her mother, where she'd performed normalcy with the discipline of someone who had decided that the people she loved didn't need to carry her weight on top of their own. "I'm ready," she said. Carol Ashby's piece ran at 2 in the afternoon. It was long, over 4,000 words, and it was built with the careful architecture of someone who had been assembling it for months and had waited for the right moment to release it fully. The footage was embedded near the top, But the piece itself moved well beyond a single incident. It named the former Meridian administrator who had agreed to go on record after 2 years of silence. It quoted 2 current Hargrove staff members who had witnessed the corridor incident directly and had decided that their names attached to the truth was worth more to them than anonymity attached to nothing. It detailed the financial relationships between Halverson's foundation and 3 separate hospital systems. You tracing the money through procurement decisions and contract awards and the quiet adjustments that institutions make when the people funding them start expressing preferences. It outlined, with documentation, a pattern that any single piece of it, seen in isolation, might have looked like coincidence. Seen together, it looked like what it was. And near the center of it, in her own words, unedited and attributed, Danielle Carter, charge nurse, Hargrove Medical Center. I've been a nurse for 9 years, the quote read. I've dealt with difficult patients, difficult families, and difficult situations. I know the difference between someone having a hard day and someone who believes the rules don't apply to them. What happened to me wasn't a bad day. It was a demonstration. Might he wanted everyone in that corridor to understand what happens when someone like me doesn't move out of the way. She had chosen those words carefully. She had thought about them for a long time before she said them to Carol, and she had not changed them when Carol read them back for confirmation. They were exactly what she meant, said in exactly the way she meant it. The piece spread through the afternoon across channels Danielle didn't track, into conversations she wasn't part of, into offices and break rooms and comment sections where people she would never meet were forming their own responses to something she had lived. By evening, 3 national outlets had picked it up. By the following morning, it was everywhere. More staff came forward, not all at once. It happened over the course of 4 days, in the measured, a careful way that people come forward when they have been silent for a long time and have decided that silence has cost them enough. A surgical nurse who had witnessed Halverson berate a young resident in a hallway 6 months ago and had been told by her supervisor that it wasn't worth pursuing. An administrator who had raised concerns about procurement irregularities 2 years prior and had been reassigned to a different department without explanation. A physician at a separate facility who had been watching the coverage and finally called the number at the bottom of Carol Ashby's piece. Each account was its own story. Each one was also part of the same story, the story of a man who had operated for decades in environments that rewarded his money more than they protected the people around him. Danielle read some of the accounts online and didn't read others. She was 34 weeks pregnant, and she was working her scheduled shifts, and she was trying to manage her energy the way you manage it when you know you're approaching something physically demanding and can't afford to arrive depleted. But she read enough to understand that what was happening was larger than her, and that this understanding, which might have felt diminishing in another context, felt, in this one, like relief. Like she had been carrying a stone and had set it down and found that other people had been carrying pieces of it all along. The formal charges were filed on a Friday. Not dramatic ones, not the exaggerated version of justice that exists in films, where everything resolves in a single decisive moment, with a speech and a verdict and a door closing loudly behind someone. Real charges, criminal assault, filed by the DA's office following a review of the footage, 11 witness statements, and Danielle's formal complaint, which she submitted the same week Carol's piece ran. Corporate misconduct charges related to the procurement irregularities, filed by a separate regulatory authority after the board audit concluded its first phase. A civil suit from the Meridian administrator who had retained her own counsel and, by all accounts, intended to see it through. Halverson did not appear in public on the day the charges were filed. His legal team released a statement that said, in 2 careful paragraphs, essentially nothing of consequence. 3 of his foundation's board members quietly announced their resignations over the following week, each citing personal reasons, none of which were believable, and none of which needed to be. 2 hospital systems announced they were reviewing their financial relationships with his foundation pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. A 3rd quietly removed his foundation's name from a planned building dedication. None of it happened loudly. There was no single scene of dramatic collapse, no perp walk, no public reckoning in a room full of cameras. The architecture of his influence, the web of financial dependencies and social agreements and institutional relationships that had allowed him to move through the world as though accountability was a system that existed for other people, was dismantling itself methodically. Sell one structural element at a time, not because anyone tore it down, because it had been built on assumptions that had turned out to be wrong. Someone had been willing to stay standing. Someone had kept a USB drive. Someone had made the calls that needed making. And all of that, accumulated and combined, had been enough. On the Thursday before the charges were filed, Darius came to find Danielle on the hospital floor during her afternoon shift. He found her near the nurse's station, updating a patient chart with the focused efficiency she had always brought to paperwork, moving through it quickly, without wasted motion, the way someone moves when they have done a task 10,000 times, and their hands know what they're doing, even when their mind is somewhere else. She looked up when she heard his footsteps and read his expression immediately. She had always been able to read him. It was one of the things they shared without discussing it, this ability to decode each other across whatever distance, physical or emotional, had accumulated between their last conversation. "It's moving," he said, keeping his voice low between them. "Legal told me this morning the DA's office is ready." She nodded slowly. "And Halverson?" "He tried to negotiate this week," Darius said. "Privately. Through Clifton. He wanted to discuss a settlement structure that would involve dropping the assault charge in exchange for a substantial number." "What happened?" "I told Clifton that Danielle Carter doesn't accept settlements with non-disclosure clauses." He paused. "You with the slight quality of someone choosing whether to add something. I may have also noted that making the offer demonstrated a continued failure to understand what this situation actually is. Despite everything, despite all of it, the weeks of it, the weight and exhaustion of it." Danielle almost smiled. "You said that." "Words to that effect." She looked back at her chart for a moment, let the silence hold. Then, "Darius, when this is over, when the legal process runs its course and the news has moved on to something else, I want you to know that I understand what you put aside to come home, what it cost you, what you'll carry back when you go." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had landed accurately, and he was deciding what to do with that. "You didn't need me to fight this," he said at last. "Oh, you were already fighting it. You just needed someone to stand next to you while you did." She looked at him. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Down the hall, a patient called for a nurse, and somewhere behind her, a monitor beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. "Go stand next to someone who needs it," she said softly. "Whatever that looks like where you're going." He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once, small, certain, and that was enough. 3 months later, the hallway looked exactly the same. Same fluorescent lights with their particular hum, same antiseptic smell layered under the ambient warmth of a floor that ran around the clock. Same noise of a busy hospital moving through its daily routines with the particular efficiency of a system that doesn't pause for anything. Not for grief, not for triumph, not for any single person's story, no matter how significant that story might be to the people inside it. The ICU entrance was where it had always been. The stretch of corridor where it had happened was just a stretch of corridor. No marker, no evidence, nothing to tell a stranger passing through what had occurred there on an otherwise ordinary morning several months ago. Danielle walked through it on a Tuesday, first shift back after her leave, and felt something she hadn't anticipated feeling, the absence of weight. Not a dramatic lifting of burden, not a cinematic moment of triumph where the music swells and everything resolves. Just the quiet, ordinary fact of walking down a hallway and not having to manage anything while doing it. Not her expression, not her pace, not the careful calibration of what she was allowed to feel in a space that had once taken something from her. She was just walking. That was all. It was enough. People looked at her differently now, not all of them, and not in a way that anyone narrated aloud. No one stopped her to make a speech or deliver a formal acknowledgement. But the texture was different. The eye contact held a beat longer than it used to. Conversations opened more readily. A doctor she barely knew nodded at her with an expression that communicated, without any words at all, that he knew what she had done and thought it mattered. She did her job. She checked on her patients. She updated her charts and coordinated care and answered questions and moved through the floor with the same quiet efficiency she had always brought to it. The work was the same. She was the same. But the environment around her had shifted in the way environments shift when the implicit agreements inside them change. Slowly, incompletely, but genuinely. The hospital had implemented 3 new accountability measures in the preceding 2 months. A formal policy requiring all visitor incidents to be logged within 4 hours, regardless of the visitor's affiliation with the institution. An independent reporting channel for staff managed by a third-party firm that bypassed the internal HR process, and a review of all existing vendor and funding relationships to assess whether financial ties had any documented influence on administrative decisions. None of these changes were announced with particular fanfare. They appeared in staff communications as policy updates, of the kind that circulate through institutional bureaucracy without ceremony. But Danielle had read each one carefully when it arrived in her inbox, and she understood what each one meant and what it had taken to make them real. Sandra was back on the floor full-time. The termination proceeding had collapsed within a week of Sandra's lawyer sending a single letter, a precise documented letter that outlined the timeline of the performance concerns relative to the date of the incident report and requested clarification on the institutional policy that governed adverse employment actions taken within 90 days of a protected disclosure. The administration had withdrawn the proceeding without comment. Sandra had returned to her shift the following Monday as though she had simply been off for a few days, because that was who Sandra was. She found Danielle near the medication room on her first day back and said, without ceremony, "You look good." "You look better," Danielle said. Sandra looked at her for a moment. "It was the right thing," she said, not triumphantly, just as a fact she had settled with herself some time ago and was stating plainly. "It was," Danielle agreed. They went back to their patients. Darius left on a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the charges were filed. He came to the apartment the night before with takeout from the place on Fenton Street that Danielle had been craving for 3 weeks and that he'd remembered without being told, because that was the kind of attention he paid to things when the people he loved were involved. He didn't make a production of it. He just set the bags on the counter and started unpacking containers while their mother asked him questions about where he was going, and he deflected each one gently, with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing exactly that for years and had learned to do it in a way that didn't feel like a door closing. After dinner, the 3 of them sat in the living room with the television on at low volume, doing nothing in particular. Yvonne with her knitting, Darius with a book he wasn't really reading, Danielle with her hand resting on her stomach, and the ordinariness of it was something she wanted to hold on to. Later, after their mother had gone to bed, Danielle and Darius sat on the fire escape with the city below them in its nighttime configuration. Quieter sounds, different light, the same steady continuity it always had. Are you scared?" she said. She meant about where he was going. She didn't say that directly because she never did, and neither did he. That unspoken navigation was part of how they had managed the space between his world and hers for as long as his world had been what it was. "No," he said. A pause stretched between them, longer than his usual ones. "A little?" She appreciated the honesty. He didn't offer it often. She reached over and put her hand briefly on his arm, and he let her, and then they both looked back at the city. "She's going to want to know her uncle," Danielle said. "She?" he said, looking over. "Found out last week," Danielle said. Didn't know how to work it into conversation. Something crossed his face, something unguarded, softer than his usual composure. He looked out at the city for a moment, jaw working slightly, and when he looked back at her, whatever it was had settled but hadn't gone away. "Tell her I'll be back," he said. "I will," she said. "Tell her yourself when you get here." He left the next morning before she woke up. He'd made coffee and done the dishes before he went, and there was a note under her mug that said only, "You were already winning." She kept the note. Hargrove Medical Center's annual report, released 6 weeks later, included a brief section under institutional accountability, noting that the hospital had cooperated fully with all relevant investigations and had implemented new staff protection policies in response to an internal review. It did not name anyone. It did not describe what had happened in any detail that would allow a reader to reconstruct it. But it was there, in print, in a document that went into the permanent record of the institution. Richard Halverson's name appeared in a different kind of document that same month, a court filing listing the formal charges, the evidence of record, and the names of the witnesses who had agreed to testify. His legal proceedings would take time. They would be complicated and contested, and there would be months ahead where the outcome was uncertain. That was the nature of real consequences. They were not clean, they were not fast, but they had begun, and they were real, and they were not going away. His foundation's charitable giving for the year was down 63%. 3 board members had resigned. The cardiology wing expansion at Hargrove had been quietly restructured to remove his foundation's name from the lead donor position. He still had resources. He still had his legal team. He had a great deal less than he'd had 6 months ago, and less still than he'd had on the morning he'd walked into a hospital and decided that the rules applied to everyone except him. Danielle's daughter was born on a Thursday morning, 7 weeks after Darius left. The labor was long and complicated in the way that things are sometimes long and complicated without becoming catastrophic, which is its own kind of grace. 17 hours. There were moments in the middle of it where Danielle's body felt like something entirely outside her control, which was, she would think later, a strange experience for someone whose professional life had been built around managing difficult physical situations with calm and precision. But being on the other side of it was humbling in a way that she filed away to think about more carefully when she was less exhausted. Her mother was in the waiting room the whole time. Danielle knew this without being told, the same way she'd always known when Yvonne was nearby, a particular quality of presence that didn't need to announce itself. One of the nurses on the delivery team was someone Danielle had trained alongside years ago, and the familiarity of her face across the room was a comfort in the way that familiar competence always is when you are at the absolute edge of your own. When it was over, when the room had settled into its quiet aftermath, and the weight had been placed in her arms, small and warm and impossibly present. Danielle looked down at her daughter for a long time without speaking. She had her father's mouth. She had Danielle's eyes, dark and wide and looking at the world with the calm alertness of someone who has just arrived and is already paying careful attention to what they've found. She wasn't crying anymore. She was looking, taking stock, recalibrating. Danielle had the thought, briefly and without sentimentality, that her daughter was going to be just fine. She thought about the corridor, the wall, the hand that had gone to her stomach before she'd even processed what had happened, the instinct to protect something that hadn't yet arrived in the world. She had protected her. She was here now. They both were. Danielle held her and breathed slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The same rhythm she taught patients in distress. It turned out it worked just as well for everything else. Her mother came in 20 minutes later and stood in the doorway for a moment, one hand pressed to her mouth, before she crossed the room and sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at her granddaughter with an expression that contained more than any words Danielle could think of to describe it. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. On the nightstand beside the hospital bed, Danielle's phone lit up briefly with a message from a number with an international prefix. No words, just an emoji, a single small star. She saw it and smiled. Weeks later, walking the same corridor where it had all begun, Danielle moved through the familiar noise and light of the hospital floor and felt herself simply present in it. Not managing it, not bracing against it, just working in it the way she had always worked. With the same competence and the same care and the same quiet refusal to be less than what she was. She paused at the nurse's station to pick up a chart. Someone had taped a small note to the edge of the monitor, not official, just handwritten, in the rounded cursive of someone who'd left it without signing it. "You changed something here," it read. "Thank you." She looked at it for a moment, then she tucked it into her pocket, picked up the chart, and went to her patient. Some people think power is loud, but the strongest kind, the kind that lasts, never breaks. When someone with power raises their hand against someone they think is powerless, what does it say about us if we look away? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more stories that remind you what real strength actually looks like.